this through the talk today and the publication, which is primarily aimed at designers, of course, but it's been written, and indeed the subject is in any event applicable and of direct interest to principal designers, but also to contractors and to clients, because they, after all, are the ones that are on the receiving end of any poor design. But I'm going to start with Grenfell Tower. I think most people would be aware of the terrible event that occurred just under 4 years ago. And at an ICE seminar similar to this a year ago, Dame Judith Hackett expressed the opinion that I've put up on the screen there, that we need to move from a view that it won't happen here or to us to a position of chronic unease. And that's not really a very happy place to be either. And so my question there I've posed at the bottom, do we appreciate that? And what are we going to do to get ourselves out of this position of chronic unease? Well, I'm going to return to Grenfell a little later on. What I want to do this morning is, or today I should say, it may not be morning for some of you, is to look at three things: the industry itself and just a few background issues which, to my view, have a considerable influence on this subject area. And then, as you'd expect, spend the meat of the time on design risk management itself and sorting an old problem, because that, to my mind, is what it is. And then to finish off, maybe somewhat unusually, by asking for you to go away with some actions. So that's the way I hope to run it. So let's move in straight away to the first one. So I need to move back. I've gone forward. Here we are. I've got three things I mentioned. The first one, we have a construction industry, which is really an umbrella term, but we are in fact a very, very fragmented industry, very diverse sub-industries, house building, utilities, heavy civils, and so on, often with little in common, and yet all under this one umbrella. We have enormous range in sizes of organizations, from the prolific sole practitioner, particularly in structural engineering, through to the multinational, all working again and under the same umbrella. There is a wealth of advice for designers, but the vast majority of that advice is aspirational. It will encourage the designer to review, to consider, to reduce, to compare, eliminate and reduce. But in a harsh commercial environment, when the law isn't specific, that isn't sufficient to come up with an answer. So what we need to do is put some detail into that, which is again what I hope to do. And then there's the inconsistency I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that there is no methodology accepted, nor rather any thorough examples. And the second point relates to the legal basis. Regulation 9 is the regulation under the CDM regulations themselves, which deals with the designer's obligation to have regard to other people. And that is, if you like, a particularized version of Section 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is a broader version of the same obligation. And that works well for other industries, and indeed it works well for constructors in the industry. But where a designer is producing designs and they have no contact with those who are going to execute those, the system really falls down, and it really wasn't envisaged that it would occur in those circumstances. So we have to find a way around that. So those are two difficult areas that we have to deal with. But then the third one is not a difficult area. It's a reminder, really. And if we're looking to understand why things go wrong, or to put it more positively, how we can make sure they don't, then the 3 Ps, people, process, and product, is a really good way of thinking about this. If you do an analysis of failures, as Scott has done, as I have done, we find that the vast majority of failures fall into a combination of the first two. There's been a shortfall in the actions of the people, or a shortfall in the processes used, and I've just given some examples there. it is very rare indeed, certainly in the UK, to have a product failure. Almost invariably, it's a failure of the people and process. So those are the things we need to keep a very, very close eye on, although we can't afford to take our eye off the ball as regards the product. So those were the things I wanted to say just by way of an open and by a necessity in a fairly rapid manner. So let's move on then to the main part of the talk, really, which is about design risk management. And I've said it's an old problem because for the 26 years, we have not covered ourselves in glory in this regard. No one comes out of this well. And the old risk assessment had certainly had a very deleterious effect on the industry. It held us back for many, many years. And yet this is a great opportunity. It's an enormous opportunity to actually do better. And there are 6 things I just want to touch on as we go through, as you can see listed there. And we start with teamwork by way of a clarification. Teamwork is something we all aspire to. There are some projects, of course, where you just have a single designer where clearly you can't have teamwork if there's just one individual involved. And there are quite a number of projects in that category. But generally speaking, we have a team and we want cooperation, coordination and communication. And indeed, they are in fact statutory obligations. But important though they are, when we come down to design decisions and design risks, design orientated risks, that falls to one designer alone. You can't have a team decision on a design risk management on a specific issue. And it's important to understand that distinction. What you get is the support of cooperation and coordination and communication from others, but the decision lies with one party. The next thing I wanted to mention was what I have designated soft hazards. And this is something which is, to my experience, substantially ignored as part of the process. And a soft hazard is something which has got potential to cause harm, which after all is the definition of a hazard. And it originates as part of the design process, which is what we're talking about, but it does not result in a work activity on site. Because what has tended to happen is that we have been brought up on a menu of classic health and safety hazards, for example, working at height, noise, vibration, and so on. And they all result in activities on site. But in fact, most of the serious shortfalls and problems occur under the soft hazard heading. And here I've given some examples of items which do not receive the attention they should do, by and large, and yet wherein lie the key risks. And part of the methodology that I have spelt out in the book is that designers for each discipline need to schedule out these soft hazards where applicable and indicate what they are doing about them. So soft hazards is a really important aspect which I do not believe has had the attention it deserves. Now, the main, what one might call the engine room of my suggested methodology is by dividing up the brief that you have as a designer, and that might be as a civil engineer, structural engineer, or indeed any other architect, building services engineer, and to divide the structure that you're responsible for into what I've called elements. So an element might be the foundations, it might be the external works, it could be a drainage run, a building frame, anything that is a logical subdivision of the totality. And within those elements, there will be a range of what I've called standard or non-standard tasks that are done by contractors on site, either during the construction phase or subsequently in maintenance, planned repair or decommissioning. So if we look at these standard and non-standard tasks, a standard task is something that a contractor does as a routine operation. They do it every single day of the week. And I'm going to jump to the next slide just to give you a more full definition. So they relate to the design, obviously. They're an inherent part of the everyday construction or maintenance process. Do they have risks? Well, of course, they all have risks. But the point is that industry has accepted ways of dealing with them. And over time, of course, these improve. But there's nothing really that the individual designer can do to add to that. They're not really in a position to change that. And it would be really quite disruptive in a sense if they did. Change comes top down. I can't think of a single instance where an individual designer or even an individual company has changed something from a standard operation that has subsequently been adopted by the industry. Change comes from top down. And so what we're saying here, what I'm saying here, is that where you have a standard task, there isn't really anything the designer can do other than the last paragraph here, or the middle one. They need to ask themselves whether there is any accompanying contemporary advice, because if there is, they need to comply with it. So we have this concept of splitting the structure down into elements, asking ourselves the question whether they contain standard tasks alone or whether there are any non-standard tasks within that. And I'm going to give some examples shortly. And it's those non-standard tasks that need the attention. We spend our time on the non-standard ones. And of course, what one is trying to do with them is by altering them in some way to try and reduce their consequence, or indeed to make them back into standard tasks again. Noting that standard tasks can be affected, of course, by the location. So you could have an operation which ordinarily doesn't cause the contractor any kind of problem at all. But because of its particular location, a lack of access, or interfaces with other works, does become more problematic. And that is the kind of thing that the designer should consider. So there's the definition again. So what we'll end up with then in going through this process, and these are placed in Appendix C of the book, is first of all a single schedule which schedules out the soft hazards. It describes the brief, the resource, and other soft hazards, some of which I've already mentioned, with a clear indication by the designer of the action that they propose to take. And then that is then followed by several schedules, each for an element that's been chosen by the designer, if necessary, separately covering the various phases of the project, as I've listed here. Now, one can see that if one of your elements is the foundations of a building, then normally speaking, you'd only need to cover construction issues. You wouldn't have to have a sheet relating to maintenance and repair, because that would not be envisaged, nor indeed currently, for most cases, decommissioning, where, for example, exposed steelwork, where all those would be relevant, and you need a separate consideration for all of those. And the element you've chosen will encompass the standard and maybe some non-standard tasks. If they're standard alone, then no further action at all. If there are non-standard tasks, then the designer needs to give them a bit more thought to see how they can be improved in some way and what information the contractor might need about them. For standard tasks, by definition, there is no need to pass on any information at all to the contractor, because it is what they do. It's their bread and butter stuff. And then the final part, as I've mentioned, is that the designer needs to ask themselves whether there is any specific contemporary guidance that needs to be heeded. Now, I put that word specific in deliberately. What we do not want is schedules of aspirational guidance documents. This is specific contemporary guidance. Just by way of example, here are some which fall under that category. There is an ICE note on the standard of building regulations submissions under Part A, because it was found that these were often of very poor quality. And various aspects in there are detailed out as to what the designer should do very specifically when submitting. So the question is, does the design comply with that? And if not, well, there has to be a justification given, because in some cases there may be a reasonable excuse for not doing it. It may not fit in some way, but generally speaking, it should be complied with. In the Car Park Designer's Handbook, Chapter 15 gives very specific details on risk management, whereas the rest of the book is somewhat generalized. So that's a particular element of that guide. The Roofwork Guidance Note gives specific guidance on edge distances. The Site Hoarding Guide, written by the Temporary Works Forum, gives very detailed guidance on the design of hoardings, which can kill people if they're not properly designed. And so one would expect any hoarding on a construction site to indicate the designer to indicate that it has been designed in accordance with that document. And so on. And see the last one, safe access to maintenance and repair. That is in there not for the totality, but because it includes some specific advice on the way in which information should be passed through to the client on the assumed methods of access for maintenance and repair items in the future. So what we can see here is that by including these guidances, we are going to at least attain the expected standard. And as the guidance is added to in the future, then standards will rise. Because these are placed in Appendix B. Now, there's Appendix B in the book, which of course is fixed, it's as published, but we also have Appendix B as a digital version on the ICE virtual bookshop site. And that is a free to download appendix, and it will be updated as new guidance becomes available. And I'm really pleased to say that BCSA, the British Constructional Steelwork Association, SECA, Civil Engineering Contractors Association, and the Temporary Works Forum have all agreed to consider writing additional guidance from their perspective relating to design. And I'm in discussion with some other industry organizations for them to do the same, which will be, I think, a really good step forward and something that has never been done before. So let's take just a few examples. We have an office block surrounded, as one does, with a pretty standard car park, footways, lighting, drainage, and that kind of thing. Now, in the normal course of events, there is nothing unusual about that. It is a logical element of the works, and it contains standard work tasks familiar to a competent contractor who will have processes in place to deal with the risks that arise. There is nothing realistically the designer can do. So that would be entirely made up of standard work tasks. There is no further information that the contractor needs. The next thing for the designer to ask is, well, is there any guidance I need to be following? And indeed there is, because there is an ICE note on paving flags, should that be used. What might make this contain non-standard elements? Well, if we had an access from the car park onto the highway, and the highway had a very heavy pedestrian footfall, heavy traffic, and maybe utilities to deal with, then that would logically and realistically be classified as non-standard. That flags up to the designer. They need to do some more work on that. What about traffic management proposals, specifying the standard of footways to ensure that they are suitable for those with mobility impairment and so on? And that could well then reduce that from a non-standard task back down to a standard task again. Let's move on to the middle one. We have an in situ concrete frame to this office block that goes with the car park. Again, concrete frames 3 or 4 stories high of this type, they go up in every town and city of the country every week. Nothing unusual. A competent concrete frame contractor will take this in their stride. There is nothing the designer needs say. However, there are specific guidance issues that go with that, and specifically from the Temporary Works Forum regarding propping, regarding the adequacy of the slab to take the predictable wheel loads from MUPs and things like that, which will be used at a later stage to maybe erect the facade and things of that type. And there's a book published by the Concrete Centre on designing for safer concrete structures, which again gives guidance to designers of the things they need to allow for in their design. And one would expect the designer to sign all these off as being documents they have complied with, or to give a good reason if they haven't. And lastly, a refurbishment problem. So here, a project. So here we might have a 3 or 4 story building with a basement. It's being refurbished, and in the basement, we're taking out some of the internal load-bearing walls, and these walls go right up the building. So we're having to put in replacement steel beams. Now, if this was new build, that kind of work would be a standard task. There's no particular issue. But being a refurbishment project, it throws up a whole load of special issues. How do they get the beams into the basement? Having got them in, how do you get them into position? So one might see the designer here detailing the grounds floor slab with an access hole in it to allow the beams to be inserted into the basement. One might see the designer thinking, well, rather than having one very heavy universal beam, we'll split it into 4 and bolt them together when they're in position. Splices might be something else that are introduced. And having taken those measures, the designer might legitimately conclude that there are now no non-standard tasks. All that means that it can be classified as standard tasks for a competent contractor. They would also look to see if there's any particular guidance that needs to be complied with. I can't think of any, but there may well be. So there's 3 examples of an element you might have and the actions of the designer. And in the book, there's a flow chart showing the kind of routes that one might take. So you to ask, is it a standard work task? And if it is there any guidance available? Are you adopting it or not? And if you haven't, have you given the justification, and so on? So what we're going to land up with then is what I call rather like a pack of cards. We're going to have our first card in the pack, which is Appendix C1, which deals with the design parameters of the soft hazards. A clear summary of how the soft hazards have been accommodated, checking, validation of software, site supervision, the brief, and so on. And then we're going to have a series of cards in the pack C2, which all deal with the elements. Now, on a simple job, you might just have 3 or 4 sheets, maybe even 1. On more complex projects, obviously, you're going to have many. All this lends itself to digitization, and the number of sheets per element, as I've mentioned, will depend on whether they only have to represent the construction phase or whether they have to reflect maintenance and removal as well. And that will make up a pack. And the beauty of this is that there is a very clear beginning, a middle, and an end. It's clearly defined. The line manager of the designer will very quickly be able to see visually to what extent the designer has considered the brief that they have. The principal designer, who has the responsibility, after all, of being satisfied that designers are doing what they should do, again has a very clear visual model to have a look at. Whereas at the minute, there is no framework, and no doubt different designers do it in different ways. So this brings a discipline to it that should be beneficial to all. So just to summarize then, the key methodology here. This will suit any project from any sector of any size. Clearly, in the really big complex projects, the number of sheets in the pack will grow. One could choose one's elements to tie in with other designers, the architect, for instance, or the building services engineer, so there's compatibility there if that was helpful. And it is obviously led by designers because this is design risk management, but it is useful to others, for PDs, for contractors to see how the designer has approached the project, and for clients who are interested in the longer term. It includes soft hazards, probably for the first time. Um, it recognizes that there is no point in spending a lot of time on standard tasks per se, but we do need to spend time on non-standard tasks to try and get rid of as many as we can, or to provide the contractor with the relevant information where they remain as non-standard at the end of the day, which will be quite a quite acceptable solution. We land up with this pack, this definable pack, and penultimately, it explicitly requires designers to have regard to contemporary specific guidance produced by their peers, or to justify why they haven't accommodated it, and it is of use to PDs. So the penultimate thing I wanted to talk about was communication. In my view, it is the single most important word we have, communication, and yet I'm sure everyone's got their own views on this or experiences, but my experience is we're not good at it. Other professions are not either, but we're not good at it. And there's a whole range of reasons which I don't have time to talk about today, why we're not good at it. Too little can be very costly to clients and contractors. It's inefficient, and indeed it can be dangerous. But equally, too much can have similar problems. I have seen on a number of occasions over the last few years drawings where the design company has decided to use hazard symbols. And they have, obviously, the designer has gone through that drawing and thought of every possible hazard they could think of and slapped on a hazard symbol. And the result is that there's far, far too many. And the key message gets lost. And that itself is a hazard. We have to be much more thoughtful about the information and resist the temptation to give too much, as well as avoiding the shortfall of too little. So communication, this is a very short slide, but it's a very, very important one for effective risk management. Now, I said I wanted to return to Grenfell. We're just coming up next month to the 4th anniversary of that terrible event. And you'll all recognize the picture in the bottom left-hand corner here. The top right-hand corner is in Dubai, I think, a fire in a tower block there. The top left-hand corner is in London again. It's Lakanal House, a fire which occurred 6 years before Grenfell, and yet none of the lessons were taken on board by those who were involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project. And the bottom left-hand corner is Summerland on the Isle of Man, an event of quite some time ago, but of such seriousness that also led to the changes in building regulations. Now, I've been quite involved with Grenfell and have followed it very closely over the last 4 years, including the inquiry. And what I've been interested in particular are the root causes, not the superficial causes, but the root causes of Grenfell. Because the characteristic of root causes, as we know, is that they apply not just to high-rise residential buildings, but they can apply to any structure of any type in any project sector. And I've come up with this list, which I believe reflects the root causes. And you'll notice some characteristics about this list. First of all, fire isn't mentioned anywhere. Secondly, they are all soft hazards. And third, they can apply on, as I said, on any kind of structure, any sector. So I'll just say a few words about some of them. Novation, where we get that, the absolute essential necessity for everyone being clear on what the original brief was of the designer and whether that matches the new brief that has been given to them, whether there are any gaps. The brief itself, which needs absolute clarity, so there's no ambiguity. Obviously, the expertise within the team. To make sure we do not rely on building control as a check. The designer themselves are responsible, both professionally and in a statutory sense for the adequacy of their design. One cannot rely on building control as a checking mechanism. That is wholly inappropriate. Ensuring we understand the technical issues clearly. In structural design in particular, we often get design by others. So we might get 2, sometimes even 3 designers. The absolute necessity again at each stage that a completing designer writes a briefing note to the designer whom they may never meet, to make it clear what the assumptions were, where the design stopped, what else needed to be done, and so on. I wonder how often handover notes like that occur. Clarity of responsibility. So if we move along supply chains, we do not lose that clarity as to quite who is responsible for the design. And particularly if it moves along from the client-appointed designer into the contracting chain and then down various subcontractors where there is still design to be done. And minor items, I'd like to just mention 2 here just to illustrate the importance of minor items. The Hyatt Hotel walkway collapse in Kansas, I think it was, some years ago, where 2 walkways, one above the other on suspended rods, collapsed during an afternoon tea party. 114 people died, and that arose because there was a fault in the design of the fixing detail for these hanger rods, but it was exacerbated by a change which was made. There was insufficient change control, a lack of appreciation that a small change doubled the load on the fixing. So a lack of clarity around that minor item led to dreadful consequences. The item itself probably cost a few pounds, bit of welding, a few bit of steel, very minor, but terrible consequences. And the second example is the Boston Big Dig Tunnel, which goes through Boston, and it has concrete ceiling slabs which are suspended from the underside of the box itself using epoxy fixings, or it did have. The wrong epoxy formulation was used, and one of these slabs fell, killing a motorist or the passenger in the car because of the wrong formulation. That item probably cost less than $1, and yet the overall cost of putting that right was well over $100 million. That's including all the civil actions and that kind of thing. So you've got this colossal cost, never mind the death that occurred from a lack of attention to a minor item. They really can trip us up. The need for change control, quite clearly, clear protocols. On projects of all sizes, that is necessary. And site supervision, which I've mentioned already. Site supervision is not something to be decided by the client or suggested. Should be a part of the risk management process of the designer. And one of the hazards, of course, is mistake on site, lack of quality control, and the mitigating measure is appropriate site supervision. Can you rely on the contractor? And I don't mean to be disparaging about contractors. It applies to designers as well in terms of shortfalls, because we have a track record of some disasters that have occurred or nearly occurred as a consequence of the lack of site supervision. So that should be part of the risk management process. So these are the root causes that I have extracted from the Grenfell that we all need to be aware of on projects, no matter what they are. So I said I'd finish with some suggested actions. First of all, individually. Now, my experience over the years of listening to talks and going to conferences and that thing is that quite often one might think, well, they're very interesting, that was very enjoyable and helpful, but you go back to the office and life carries on as it was. And what I'm asking is for you to have maybe look at the suggestions which have been made, the points which have been made in the book and today, and maybe have discussions in your own offices. It may be virtual at the minute, of course, and ask yourself some really deep questions. Do the things you do at the moment really add value? Are they really compliant, or are you going through a mechanistic process? How could they be improved? If you have systems, obviously you will have systems. How about trying to run the procedures suggested in this book in parallel over 2 or 3 projects and see how they compare? And then again, if you are a coal-faced designer, do you get the necessary support from your management in risk management procedures? When was the last time they got you all together to talk through what you're doing and seeing if there are any problems? And similarly, the other side of the coin, if you are a risk manager, if you are in management, how much attention do you give to those who work for you to make sure that they understand and are content with the systems that you're asking them to do? And as this is an ICE workshop, sort of webinar, I don't know who's here in perhaps a more formal capacity within the institution, but what can the institution do to take this subject forward? Provide contributions, for example, to Appendix B, and to discuss the matters which have been raised and draw those to the attention of their members. And generally, to talk to other bodies. The obvious one for the ICE in the first instance would be the IStructE, because of the connectivity of course through building structural engineering and so on. And put your submissions in. We want to increase Appendix B. We want to do more and build it up and put into Appendix B examples and details on those things which are currently unclear, and where we get variations and uncertainty. So I'm going to finish on that point, Chair. Very happy to take any questions, and you can see details of the book there. Thank you very much.
John, many thanks on behalf of all of us. That was a very, very, very helpful presentation, and good to see your book advertised there. I recommend that to everyone. Now we're into the Q&A, and we've got 20 minutes. So plenty of chance to ask John a few questions. There are a few have been coming through during the lecture, which I've been monitoring. So I'll kick off with those, but do keep them rolling in. So first one, John, what do you think is the right approach to site supervision by the designer? Perhaps you could illustrate that.
Well, as I said, I think for too long, and this has come out over many, many years through fee competition. Clearly, people are not keen to sometimes put in extra money for site supervision if they have to win a job. But the fact is that site supervision, the adequacy of site supervision, is a risk management issue like anything else. And we know that some things need closer attention than others. I mean, for example, on the Edinburgh schools, where the gable wall collapsed because the tie bars, the ties between the leaves were not put in properly, or they were absent. And there was another example of a minor item with absolute crucial importance. And we know site supervision is not as good as it should be. So what, in my view, the designers should do is look at their design and ask themselves honestly whether they think that the standard supervision level from the probably as yet unknown contractor will be adequate for the design they have produced. And if they think there is any doubt on that, if they think it needs to be topped up, maybe just for very specific activities, then that needs to be put forward as a clear recommendation to the client. So we need to bring this back in from a commercial thing into a risk management item.
Okay, thank you, John. So that takes us back to thinking about what we're doing and how we're doing it, bringing engineering judgment into that.
Yes.
A question here from Stephen Trainer. Given the emphasis on standard and non-standard tasks and the link to soft hazards, does the panel, I think that's you and me, John, believe that contractor-led design and build arrangements on an ECI basis represents an optimum approach to DRM? And is there a link to a poor, outdated approach to procurement and instance as a result of design decisions. So this is about ECI and contractor-led D&B.
Right. Well, if you remember at the beginning, I said that for some aspects of design work, the envisaged methodology of the Robins Committee in terms of Section 3 of the Act and falls down, because there is a complete separation between those who are designing this thing and those who are going to build it. Now, ECI brings us back to where we should be. A close cooperation between those who design and those who contract. And where we do get this contractual link between the two and close cooperation, then we should not get any problems. We should find that the design on site is exactly as the contractor wants it. And we should also, of course, find it's exactly as the client wants it. There have to be adequate controls regarding the quality. I don't mean the quality on site, but just the quality of the overall product, and that the commercial aspects are right. But that is really what we should be doing. The disjointed nature of our industry, if you compare it with other industries, is really highly questionable. And that was brought up by Wolstenholme, in his report, Never Waste a Good Crisis. I mean, the way we organize ourselves is not good. So ECI, yes, is really good.
Okay, thanks, John. So I'm keeping my mute on because I've got a thunderstorm going on here at the moment. Question here, which perhaps builds off that, is where you have a very experienced designer, or at least one who's accustomed to working with very experienced contractors, I guess, is the background of this question. They might view something as a standard task. It might end up being built, maintained, or demolished by a less experienced contractor. So how would you suggest that particular dilemma is managed?
Right. Well, I think there's a fundamental underlying assumption here, and that is that the designer has every right to assume that those who build it and those who decommission it, and indeed those who maintain and repair it, will be competent competent contractors. If you cannot assume that, the whole thing falls apart. And it's very reasonable to assume that. However, if they are aware on their project of things happening where would suggest otherwise, then clearly they need to take some action, raise it with the client or do something. But that must be an assumption that any designer can make and make comfortably.
Okay, thank you, John. Question from a slightly different perspective here. So I hope you can hear me over the hailstorm. How can we ensure inclusivity as part of Safe by Design? So I'm reading this as asking, how can we ensure all demographics of society have been properly considered in Safe by Design solutions? And I guess we're thinking here particularly around perhaps language, mobility, or mental capacity as part of that.
I'm not sure I can. I haven't thought about that, to be honest. And I think that clearly the design. Well, first of all, the design team is this. I assume this is during the design process. Is it? Is that? Or let me take it that way.
Yeah, that would be an implication.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's look at a discipline team. One assumes that you have a forward-looking employer, an inclusive employer that welcomes diversity and that kind of thing. And you, again, one can assume you have the underlying competence level. You'll have graduates in there that need supervision and so on. And the process might need to be adjusted for those who have got some impairment or mental, that kind of thing. But as long as the management process is in place, that should be, that should come out in the wash. So one might need to be very careful about pressures of work, for example. We have had problems where people have been put in charge of things on the design side, and then the pressure has been such that they have just gone under. They haven't been able to cope. So that is something that clearly needs to be, thought about. For the construction side, again, I think for the designers doesn't have to assume anything other than it will be done by a competent contractor who themselves will look after the construction issues. Now, I hope I've tackled the question. I'm not sure, I may have misunderstood it, but I hope that still covers the points that were being made.
Yeah, I think it's something for us all to think very hard about, and certainly it's easy, having been in the profession from some while ago, if you like, not to be thinking as carefully about that as we should, but it's certainly something that Grenfell has brought out, and of course Grenfell Inquiry has focused on. Different question here, just looking back at your own work a little bit, John. Question is, I'm very taken by your idea of Project 93, which I guess is a bit of a play on Project 13, so Project 93. Could you tell us a little more about when and how you hatched this idea and just how important you see it to be?
Right, well, I need to explain what that is, because I didn't mention it in my talk, but it is in the book. What struck me when researching this book is that, and I'm sure people listening in today will recognize this, is that much of what is publicized and talked about relates to big projects. And the industry initiatives, the photographs, the terminology, all seems to be geared towards the big project. The one person band, the 3-person practice from Berries and Evans that I use in the book. That's a hypothetical practice, I ought to add. But that actually represents a large part of the industry, very small practices, and they will find no synergy with these initiatives that talk in terms of these large projects. And so the concept of Project 93 it's meant to be aimed at the bulk of the industry that work on the much smaller project, what I call the high street project. And the idea of Project 93 is to take the initiatives that are already out there, but put them into terminology and examples and so on that will be recognized by the bulk of the industry that work on the smaller projects, but also need this advice as well.
Okay, thanks, John. So I recommend the book there. I think it's a very salutary reminder for all of us who think we have leadership positions in the industry to bear this really important point in mind. Turning to another question here that's come through, referring to Regulation 9 in CDM, which says all designers should eliminate and or reduce all risks so far as is reasonably practical. A standard task could involve a high risk, so designers should, under Reg 9, be looking to eliminate or reduce, not just pass it on to a contractor. For example, work in vicinity of buried services is very standard, but has a high recurrence and high consequence. I guess the thinking there is you could move the excavation somewhere else if you could. Designers should be trying to reduce or eliminate them. What are your thoughts there, John?
Yeah, that is what the clause says. But what this process does, is it says, well, these risks have already been looked at by industry, and they have come up with accepted solutions. And you only got to think for a minute. If the designer had to, in fact, start from scratch on every single risk, even if you took something as simple as a first floor concrete slab, you go through every single risk on that, from putting up the pulse work to pouring it to striking it, you'd never move the design along. Coupled with the fact that the designer is not in a position to go out on a limb and alter what really are standard industry practices, because what's going to happen? The cost is going to go up. Just as one example. Now we know that if the cost of reducing a risk is proportionate to that risk, then the designers are obligated to do it. But who is going to say whether that is proportionate or not? Because there is no information out there whatsoever to allow that to be answered. What we do know is that existing work practices on site, which make it a standard task. What we do know is that those work practices are accepted by industry. They're accepted by HSE as being acceptable. They don't get rid of all the risks, but they bring them down to a manageable level, which is deemed to be acceptable. Does that mean to say they're always going to be that level? No, of course not. We've all got examples where over the years, over the decades, things have changed as expectations have risen. But there's nothing that the individual designer can do on a particular job regarding that, uh, for the reasons I've given. So the way we're going to raise standards is by writing these guidance notes for where we have gaps to set the standard and the expectations of what we expect designers to do. So I hope that answers it, because I know some people are concerned about the fact that that clause does say all risks, but you only have to think of it. I would suggest that someone choose a simple structure and write down, schedule out all the risks that they'd have to look at. And then more pertinently, what are they going to do with those risks? How are they going to deal with them? Every single one. And you soon see it's simply an impracticable proposition. And it applies to all other industries as well. Other industries have standard ways of working in healthcare, moving patients, for example, putting patients in and out of baths, out of beds. In retail, all other industries have standard methodologies that have been developed by the experts in those industries. They do not get rid of all risks, but they bring them down to a level which everyone accepts is a tolerable level. And then every now and again, they are improved as new processes and new materials and practices come into being. But you don't get individual nurses going around reinventing methods for putting people into baths. You accept the standard process, and that's how things move on.
Yeah, I guess where there's the opportunity to reduce risk, one takes it. But I think that perhaps the new bit of thinking you're bringing to the table, John, which I welcome, is this idea that there is a kind of long tail that perhaps can be treated in the manner that you're describing. But yeah, I mean, if you think of process safety, if you can make some pretty simple changes to the design so that you eliminate things of high hazard, then clearly one should do that. I have to say, from my background in temporary works, I was always thinking, well, if the worst happened, how would I stand up and say, I did all that was reasonably practical with a clear professional conscience?
Now, there's something else I just perhaps I mentioned how I've been talking to BCSA and Seeker and so on, and I went to them deliberately because I thought, well, how can we go about raising standards? Because the individual designer is not in a position to do that. And the obvious thing is to go to the people who are harmed. And so what I said to BCSA and Seeker was that what is it that you find in terms of the design outputs that cause you grief to your people on site? What would you like designers not to do or to do? And so that is what they're going, I'm hoping that they are going to provide guidance on. So that will in itself have the effect of raising standards and reducing risk. So we're approaching it from the opposite end that has hitherto been suggested. And the same with clients in terms of maintenance and planned repair. What is it that they want seen done in designs that makes their life easier?
Yeah, I think we could summarize that. It's about being joined up and it's about being empathic.
Yeah.
I think if we can move that journey forward, we'd all be doing a great day's work. John, thank you so much. I'm sorry, everyone, our time is nearly up and I need to draw this to a close. I'm sure we've all got things to move on to today. We've had only an hour to explore this immensely important subject, designing a safer built environment. Hearing your guidance, John, on the management of design risk, it's been fascinating. You brought many ideas, completely fresh ideas to the table, and you've made it clear what our duties are and provided clear guidance on how to proceed, and that's extremely welcome. Those in industry leadership roles, was implied through the questioning your Project 93 idea, I think is a very salutary reminder that we must not forget any part, or perhaps I should say the most part of the industry when setting strategy. But before we part, I'd like to thank our audience. Thank you to everyone. It's been great to have your engagement today and your many questions. We haven't managed to answer all the questions. Those that are remaining, John promises he'll put up a LinkedIn post and he will treat those in that manner, and details will be sent to you of how to access that. I'm sure John will be making more presentations, so if you wish to engage with John further, you can do that. And also his book is out there, and I've read his book and I heartily recommend it. So from us all, John, thank you immensely for your presentation today and all your work, all your reflection, all your thinking, everything you brought to this subject. It's been absolutely super. And thank you everyone in the audience and watching, and those who watch in future, and good luck to everyone. Goodbye.